All right, as you see in the bulletin, the title of the message this morning is Saul's Last Stand. And we have a couple of chapters yet here in this book. But I'd like to begin with this illustration. Man by the name of Mike Yaconelli, I believe is how it is pronounced. He says this. He says, I live in a small rural community. And there are lots of cattle ranches around here. And every once in a while, he says, a cow wanders off and gets lost. Some of you might be familiar with that just in our farming area. But he goes on and says, ask a rancher how a cow gets lost, and chances are he will reply, well, the cow starts nibbling on a tuft of green grass, and when it finishes, it looks ahead to the next tuft of green grass and starts nibbling on that one. And then it nibbles on a tuft of green grass right next to a hole in the fence. And it then sees another tuft of green grass on the other side of the fence. And so it nibbles on that one, and then it goes on to the next tuft. And the next thing you know, the cow has nibbled itself into being lost. It's a little bit of a humorous illustration there of a cow wandering away from the fence in pasture, but it gives us an illustration of the human condition and what happens sometimes with us humans that we get lost just by simply wandering farther and farther away from the truth of God's Word, God's Holy Spirit in our lives. And I use that illustration to open us and open our minds and our hearts up to what we have here in these last couple of chapters here of 1 Samuel. As we open this final chapter in King Saul's life, we find that Saul indeed was wandering far away from being the king that God had intended him to be. We know that as the book of 1 Samuel began, it began with the Israelites, the nation of Israel, crying out to Samuel, requesting Samuel to give them a king. They wanted to be like the other nations. They wanted to have a king to lead them into battle and to fight their battles and to provide leadership and direction for them. And so God gave them a king. He gave them a king who stood out in many ways above those around him. But Saul was really not the king that God wanted him to be. And it was because of choices that Saul made. But nevertheless, we're going to see in more ways than one in these last few chapters of 1 Samuel are the tragic tale of a leader who is in desperation and who is stooping to new lows in his life and character in order to endeavor to salvage his kingdom and his authority. And so with that, I'm going to begin reading out of chapter 28. Starting at verse 1, we're going to read this entire chapter here, and then we'll take a look at it. In those days, the Philistines gathered their forces to fight against Israel. Achish said to David, you must understand that you and your men will accompany me in the army. David said, then you will see for yourself what your servant can do. Achish replied, very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life. Now Samuel was dead, and all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in his own town of Ramah. Saul had expelled the mediums and spiritists from the land. The Philistines assembled and came and set up camp at Shunem. While Saul gathered all the Israelites and set up camp at Gilboa. When Saul saw the Philistine army, he was afraid. Terror filled his heart. He inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him by dreams or Urim or prophets. Saul then said to his attendants, find me a woman who is a medium, so that I may go and inquire of her. There is one in Endor, they said. So Saul disguised himself, putting on other clothes. And at night he and 2 men went to the woman. "Consult a spirit for me," he said, "and bring up for me the one I name." But the woman said to him, "Surely you know what Saul has done. He has cut off the mediums and spiritists from the land. Why have you set a trap for my life to bring about my death?" Saul swore to her by the Lord, "As surely as the Lord lives, you will not be punished for this." Then the woman asked, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" "Bring up Samuel," he said. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out at the top of her voice and said to Saul, Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." The king said to her, "Don't be afraid. What do you see?" The woman said, "I see a spirit coming up out of the ground." "What does he look like?" he asked. "An old man wearing a robe is coming up," she said. Then Saul knew it was Samuel, and he bowed down, and he prostrated himself with his face to the ground. Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" "I am in great distress," Saul said. "The Philistines are fighting against me, and God has turned away from me. He no longer answers me either by prophets or by dreams. So I have called on you to tell me what to do." Samuel said, "Why do you consult me now that the Lord has turned away from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done what he predicted through me. The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands and given it to one of your neighbors, to David, because you did not obey the Lord or carry out his fierce wrath against the Amalekites. The Lord has done this to you today. The Lord will hand over both Israel and you to the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also hand over the army of Israel to the Philistines." Immediately Saul fell full length on the ground, filled with fear because of Samuel's words. His strength was gone, for he had eaten nothing all that day and night. When the woman came to Saul and saw that he was greatly shaken, she said, Look, your maidservant has obeyed you. I took my life in my hands and did what you told me to do. Now please listen to your servant and let me give you some food so that you may eat and have the strength to go on your way." He refused, and he said, "I will not eat." But his men joined the woman in urging him, and he listened to them. He got up from the ground and sat on the couch. The woman had a fattened calf at the house, which she butchered at once. She took some flour, kneaded it, and baked some bread without yeast. And then she set it before Saul and his men, and they ate. And that same night they got up and left. Well, fascinating chapter here, a fascinating account in chapter 28 here of 1 Samuel. And as it begins here, we see that David, and the chapter begins with David and his men and his position that he found himself in the country of the Philistines and living in a place called Ziklag. Let's get that map up there, Rick and Ashton. That last, actually, no, not that map. Let's go back to the map previous to that. Yes, that one there. Remember, David is living in Ziklag, and he's been under the kind of direction and authority, more or less, of Achish, king of Gath, which we see up a little higher there. We're familiar with Gath here from the book of 1 Samuel. But anyhow, David is living in Ziklag, and now the chapter begins by saying the Philistines were mobilizing once again to fight against Israel. And so now Achish, because he thinks that David has become enemies of the Israelites because of the way Saul had been treating him and all. I'm sure Achish knew about a lot of that, and we went through a good bit of that in other chapters. But Achish thinks David is really living under his control, and of course in Philistine territory in this little town of Ziklag, and that David should accompany him now to fight against the Israelites. Kind of a fascinating thought, isn't it? And Achish says to him, "You must understand that you and your men will now accompany me in my army as we go and fight the Israelites." And David responds to him, "Then you will see for yourself what your servant can do." What do you think that meant? What do you think David meant? Do you think David was going to prove to Achish what, and let him see for himself what he could do when he was fighting against Saul and all the Israelites? Well, it's a fascinating thought, and we'll get to it a little bit later. But this is how chapter 28 begins. And then Achish replies, he says, very well, I'm going to make you my bodyguard for life. Achish, the king of Gath, seemed to be so confident and so self-assured that David was on his side that he was ready here to make him his bodyguard for life. So anyhow, it's kind of a little bit of a side note to the really full story of chapter 28. But David is living in Ziklag, all of his 600 men, all of the wives, children, whatnot, all of the animals. I mean, it was a large group of people down in Ziklag getting ready to fight the Israelites now, and Achish wants David to join him. We'll catch up to that story a little bit later, but now we switch to Saul. And we see here that chapter 28 reminds us again that Samuel is dead. Samuel's no longer around. And I believe the fact that Samuel is dead is part of the reason why Saul acts the way he does. Because he realizes that once again, the Philistines are mobilizing against him, and he doesn't have Samuel anymore to go to. Now, we know that he and Samuel weren't communicating at all anymore. They hadn't probably seen each other in several years. Samuel was living in his town of Ramah, and Saul was living in Gibeah, and where he was running the kingdom from. But it reminds us here that Samuel is dead, and that the Philistines were assembling, and they had set up camp. And now let's go to the map that we just added here, the last map here. So take a look here. So way down here by the Dead Sea to the left is Ziklag. That's where David and his men have been. Up further, actually this map doesn't show Gath, but it's up further there, up towards Aphek would be where Gath is. But the Philistines were assembling at Shunem, which is way up there near the Sea of Galilee, up towards the top of that map. And the Israelites were assembling at Gilboa, which is not far from Mount Gilboa. And really, the last chapter of 1 Samuel here ends on Mount Gilboa. But Gilboa, which is not far from Mount Gilboa there, is where the Israelites were assembling. Doesn't show it here on this map. But so we're way up in the northern part of the kingdom of Israel here now, where they're assembling to do battle against, again, the Philistines and the Israelites. And we see here that when Saul, verse 5 tells us, saw the Philistine army, he was afraid, and terror filled his heart. It reminds me a little bit, that phrase there, and I'm not sure exactly why. Well, I guess I know why it was used, but we know that Saul was fighting the Philistines in some of these intervening years and parts of this story here. But it reminds us of the fear and the terror that was expressed back in chapter 17 when Goliath was stepping out from the Philistine lines of battle and challenging the Israelites. And it tells us there that Saul and the whole army were terrified. They were terrified of the Philistines. And here once again we read that Saul and the army were terrified of the Philistines. Was it because the Philistines were already assembled, they had mobilized, they were ready to go, they were ready to fight, they were ready to attack, and Israel wasn't ready? We don't really know exactly what it all was that caused Saul and the army to be filled with terror, but that's what it tells us here, that they were filled with terror. We know that Saul had fought the Philistines in some of these intervening times, and seemed to be able to subdue them, at least to some degree. Israel had success. We know that David had been fighting against the Philistines as well through some of this time, David and his men. But throughout this whole process, this wasn't the first time that Saul and the Philistines came up against each other, but once again, Saul's heart is filled with terror, and he's afraid. And I believe some of it has to do with the fact that he knows now that Samuel is dead. He doesn't have Samuel to rely on anymore. And of course, we see what happens, and we see what he does. So terror is filling his heart. He is very afraid of what's going to happen here. And the Lord was not answering him. He was trying to reach out to the Lord, it tells us. It tells us he inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him. Did not answer him by dreams. And I don't know exactly if there was a process that they tried to get answers by dreams. We know that there's various places through the Bible and the Old Testament where God spoke through dreams. But was there a process for that? I don't know exactly. But nevertheless, God wasn't answering Saul at this time. He wasn't answering him in any way by dreams or Urim or prophets. And I'm not even sure if Saul had any prophets. And maybe that's simply what is meant here. There were no prophets to help him and to reach out to. Samuel was dead. And we know David had a prophet with him who was, one who was of the line of the priests. But it tells us here that the Lord was not answering Saul. He wasn't responding to him. And Saul finally, in his desperation, he says to some of his men, he says, "Find me a medium. Find me someone who is involved in witchcraft, someone who is involved in the occult. Go find someone like that so that I may go and inquire of her." Now remember, and I read this, and I didn't really make mention of it, but in verse 3, it tells us that Samuel was dead, Israel had mourned for him, and Saul had expelled the mediums and spiritists from the land. That was one of the things that Saul had done that was a good thing. He had expelled those who were involved in witchcraft and that kind of thing, and the occult of that day, out of the land of Israel. And if they were caught, there was punishment. I'm not sure exactly what that punishment would have been, but nevertheless, Saul had done a good thing when he did that. But now in his desperation, we see that he asks his men, those who are with him, "Is there anybody that you know of who is involved in the occult, who is involved in witchcraft, who is a medium, that I can inquire of her?" And I believe he had this whole thing planned out in his mind, what he was going to attempt to do. If he could find somebody who could practice witchcraft and occultism. And so we see that his men told him, "There is one in Endor." Now, let's just look back at our map here again. So the Philistines are assembled in Shunem. The Israelites are assembled at Gilboa. Is Beth Shan mentioned there? No, I don't think so. I think somewhere, not sure where that is, where it talks about Beth Shan. But I think Gilboa, where the Israelites were assembled, is somewhere in that general vicinity there of Mount Gilboa and Beth Shan. Either way, where they were assembled, the Israelites, and where the Philistines were assembled in Shunem, was right between where this witch or this medium was in Endor. See where Endor is? So they said, there's a medium, there is a lady in Endor who does this kind of thing. And so it tells us here that that Saul disguised himself. He put on other clothes, and at night he and 2 men went to the woman. So what it means is that Saul had to basically travel past where the Philistines were assembled to get to this medium. Do you think that was a comfortable thing? For sure not. And And that was, of course, part of the reason why he disguised himself, and they went at night. But nevertheless, we see here what happens as Saul goes to this woman. And you know, one of the things that was mentioned by one of the commentators, and I think as you who are familiar with the Bible and many of the Bible stories, this story of Saul and this medium at the town of Endor is one of the strangest night scenes in all of the Bible. Can you think of some other night scenes and night stories in the Bible? Moses? All right. What about Jacob wrestling with the angel? What about I had another one in my head. I hadn't written it down. Jacob wrestling with the angel. We know, of course, Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane and praying. We know about Paul and Silas in the jail singing hymns at night. And there's a number of other stories in the Old and New Testament of stories that took place at night. Many of them had at least parts of those stories that were filled with uncertainty and unexpectedness and danger and maybe worry and fear. This one, though, is just different. It's different than all the rest. It's strange and it's very unusual. And we see that they go to Saul and these two men of his go to this woman in Endor. They travel past the Philistine army that is assembled at Shunem. And they go to Endor and they meet with this woman. And this woman expresses concern that, hey, you know, Saul has expelled all the mediums and spiritists from the land. You know, I could get in trouble for this. And Saul assures her that nothing bad will happen to you. And so he asks her to bring someone up for him. In other words, practice her whatever she was going to do, her process of occultism and witchcraft, and try to bring a spirit up from the dead. And he tells her, I want you to bring Samuel up. Saul was so desperate for an answer from God that he goes to this depth and stoops this low to turn to something that he had declared was illegal in the land of Israel. And in desperation here now and in deception, turns to this woman and wants her to bring up Samuel. And it's kind of really fascinating how this all takes place. But it seems that when this woman saw Samuel coming up, and that's how it describes it here, that Samuel more or less came up out of the ground as a spirit, and she recognized who it was, and somehow the recognition of this being Samuel caused her to realize that this was Saul who was asking her to do this. I don't know what it all was and why and how it all took place and how it all happened, that she recognized Saul as being Saul as as Samuel was coming up out of the ground. But she tells Saul says to her, he says, "What do you see?" And she says, "I see a spirit coming up out of the ground." And what does he look like? An old man wearing a robe is coming up. And then it tells us that Saul knew then that this was Samuel. And he bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. Now it's interesting here because at this point in the story, we see that now the conversation turns to between Saul and Samuel. That Samuel actually, according to the scripture here, Samuel actually spoke to him. Samuel was dead. This was his spirit. And God allowed this to happen and allowed this to take place. And now Saul is speaking with Samuel directly. And Saul explains the situation. Samuel asked him, "Why have you disturbed me in this way by bringing me up?" He says, "I'm in great distress. The Philistines are fighting me. And so I've called on you to tell me what to do." Samuel, I don't know what Saul was expecting. Saul and Samuel had been estranged for a couple years because Samuel had declared to Saul that God had rejected him and had turned away from him and had left him because of his disobedience, because of his unwillingness to carry out God's direction and God's commands. So I don't know what Saul was expecting here, but Samuel now gives him an answer. And this further terrifies Saul because ultimately he tells Saul that the Philistines are going to conquer the Israelites, are going to overtake their army, and the Lord will hand over both Israel and you to the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me, Samuel says to Saul. And the Lord will also hand over the army of Israel to the Philistines. And we see that Saul's reaction was that he fell full length on the ground, filled with fear because of Samuel's words. His strength was gone, for he had eaten nothing all that day and night. One of my commentators suggested that it was possible that Saul may have fasted for this occasion, that there may have been some understanding or concept that fasting was needed or required if you were going to consult a medium or a spiritist. So I don't know for sure why he had not eaten, but it does say that he had not eaten anything all that day and night. But nevertheless, Saul is laying prostrate on the ground. He's filled with fear, and this woman now becomes almost like a mother to him. And she says, "Listen, you need to get some food, and you need to gain your strength and go on your way." Saul, first of all, resists that. He says, "No, I'm not going to eat." But then the men who are with him encourage him to do so. And so we see that the woman gives him something to eat. And he eats, and he's strengthened, and they leave. And it says that same night they got up and they left. A very strange night scene that we don't see paralleled really anywhere else in God's Word. Have any of you ever had some strange nights? You don't need to tell us all now, but I think you can relate. Some strange nights, or some nights that brought fear and brought worry and brought concern. Can you imagine where Saul was at on this night when he realized once again that Samuel's words to him were words of really condemnation and judgment? Saul was on the verge and at the precipice of the end of his life, the end of his reign, and Saul was realizing that God indeed had departed from him, and it's a very sobering. It's a very sobering story, and it should cause all of us to realize and know that our relationship with God is just really, really important, and that we must continue to endeavor to maintain our relationship with God and keep in communication with Him in a right and a proper way. So chapter 28 ends with Saul and his two men getting up and leaving after this prediction from Samuel that God was going to give them over to the Philistines. So now chapter 29, we switch back to David and his men, and the Philistines, and the fact that Achish is expecting David to join them in fighting now against the Israelites. So I want to read these verses here now in chapter 29. So the Philistines gathered all their forces at Aphek. There we see Aphek there, which wasn't too far from Gath. And Israel camped by the spring in Jezreel. As the Philistine rulers marched with their units of hundreds and thousands, David and his men were marching at the rear, with Achish, the commanders of the Philistines. And they asked, "What about these Hebrews?" Now, I said to you that all the Philistines were gathered at Shunem. Now they're talking about this being down at Aphek. I believe there's a little bit of overlap here in the story, and this was probably as the Philistines were preparing to go to that battle. But nevertheless, it follows chapter 28 and what happens there. But the Philistine rulers began asking, "What about these Hebrews that are with you, Achish? What do you know about them?" And Achish replied, "Is this not David, who was an officer of Saul, king of Israel? He has already been with me over a year now, and from the day he left Saul till now, I have found no fault in him." But the Philistine commanders were angry with him, and they said, "Send the man back, so that he may return to the place you assigned him. He must not go with us into battle, or he will turn against us during the fighting. How better could he regain his master's favor than by taking the heads of our own men? Isn't this the David they sang about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." So Achish called David and said to him, "As surely as the Lord lives, you have been reliable, and I would be pleased to have you serve with me in the army. From the day you came to me until now, I have found no fault in you, but the rulers don't approve of you. Turn back and go in peace. Do nothing to displease the Philistine rulers." "But what have I done?" asked David. "What have you found against your servant from the day I came to you until now? Why can't I go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" And Achish answered, "I know that you have been as pleasing in my eyes as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the Philistine commanders have said, 'He must not go up with us into battle.' Now get up early along with your master's servants who have come with you, and leave in the morning as soon as it is light." So David and his men got up early in the morning to go back to the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel. Do you understand what is happening here? Do you get it? David finds himself, because of his choice in fleeing from Saul and going to the land of the Philistines, and we know that method really kind of worked for David, because we read last week that Saul no longer pursued David once David was in Philistine territory. But now David is in a position where he's living in the Philistine territory. He has the king Achish deceived into believing that all of the time that he spent in Philistine territory, he was doing raids in Israelite territory, when the fact of the matter was he wasn't doing raids in Israelite territory. He was doing raids in Philistine territory, and Achish believed him all the time. And somehow Achish never found out that David was really killing off small communities of people, of the Amalekites, who would have been connected to the Philistines and considered similar in that way. But Achish is convinced that David would go along and help fight now against the Israelites. What do you think? What do you think David would have done if they had allowed him to go with them and fight the Philistines? Fight the Israelites. Do you think David would have fought against Saul and the army of Israel? Or would have he turned on them? Turned on the Philistines? That's what the other Philistine rulers were afraid of. They recognized and they understood that this was David. This was the David that had done a lot of damage already to the Philistines. This was the David that had killed the Goliath. They're not going to let him go along with them and fight against the Israelites. They didn't trust him at all. I don't know exactly what all was going on in David's mind. I mean, he acts here now like, oh, I'm disappointed. I'm saddened that you wouldn't allow me to go along and fight against your enemies. So anyhow, but Achish finally really tells David, he says, listen, you got to go back. Go back to Ziklag. Go back to your people, and we'll fight this battle. And David listens to him, and David goes back. So kind of a fascinating portion of this story here, and part of the conclusion of this whole account here of David and Saul and the Philistine army and the Israelites. But now, chapter 30, David goes back to Ziklag, and David finds out. See, they left Ziklag. Is Ziklag on there? Yeah, Ziklag's on there. They left Ziklag. They were all the way up at Aphek. They were with the army. They were marching at the rear of the army of the Philistines with Achish. And they were all the way up to Aphek. And it was there at Aphek where all the other Israelite or Philistine commanders said, no, we can't take David along and his men. This is not going to end well. And so they send him back to Ziklag. And David goes back to Ziklag, and what does he find when he gets back to Ziklag? Have any of you read the rest of the book? Okay, I thought so. I figured so, and that's okay. David goes back to Ziklag, and what has happened? The Amalekites, who he had been picking on while all the time he was in Ziklag, all the time he was living in Ziklag, the Amalekites realized and knew that David was gone because he had gone to fight with the Philistines. And they attacked Ziklag, and they captured all of those who were living there, which included all the wives and children and whatever, and all the plunder. And they burned Ziklag. And David comes back to Ziklag, and they are just devastated. It tells us there, and I'm not going to read really any more of chapter 30 here. Well, I might, but it says that when David and his men came to Ziklag, they found it destroyed. This is verse 3. They found it destroyed by fire, and their wives and their sons and daughters taken captive. So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. David's 2 wives had been captured, and all of the other wives and people of all of the men and whatnot were captured and taken. They wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. Can you imagine the grief that they felt? And the fear that they had in their hearts that likely the Amalekites had done to their families what they had done to the Amalekites. But such wasn't the case. Somehow, God in his mercy was watching over all of these people and had protected all of the wives and all of the families. It tells us there that when they finally got to them and rescued them, that down to verse 18 and 19, David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken, including his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, young or old, boy or girl, plunder or anything else they had taken. David brought everything back. He took all the flocks and herds, and his men drove them ahead of the other livestock, saying, "This is David's plunder." God really watched over David and his men and all of the families during this time. They had burned the city, and they had probably destroyed a lot of things that belonged to them, but they hadn't killed any of the families. And they recovered every last one, it says. And they were able to bring them back. I believe there's two things that God was showing David through this. One is that probably God was showing David that it's time to get out of it's time to get out of Philistine territory. It's time to go back to where you belong. And secondly, God was just showing to David his mercy and his grace, in spite of the fact that probably David shouldn't have been in Philistine territory, and shouldn't have been living there. But God showed his grace and his mercy to him, and revealed himself to him in a difficult way, and yet in a way that showed him his mercy to him. God was with David through all of this whole portion, well, the whole book of 1 Samuel, and all of David's life thus far. We see God being with him. In spite of some of the mistakes that David had made, God was still with him, and God was watching over him and guiding him and directing him. And God continues to do that for us today. We all make mistakes. We all fall short. And quite honestly, I think Saul's biggest mistake was that Saul did not really sincerely seek out God's forgiveness and God's grace in his life and choose to do his will. When Samuel gave him that last, not this one as he was brought up from the dead, but when Samuel spoke to him the last time, we don't see ever that Saul sought out Samuel anymore. If Saul really would have wanted to get back into God's favor and good graces, I would have thought that he would have sought out Samuel. But it doesn't tell us that he did until after Samuel was dead, and then he tries to do it in this way. But through all of this, and particularly here in chapter 30, as the second last chapter of the book, we find that God is with David. I'd like to share a little illustration here just in light of this at this point. This comes from the Daily Bread. The early American Indians had a unique practice of training young braves, young Indians. On the night of a boy's 13th birthday, after learning hunting, scouting, and fishing skills, he was put to one final test. He was placed in a dense forest to spend the entire night alone. Until then, he had never been away from the security of the family and the tribe. But on this night, he was blindfolded and taken several miles away. When he took off the blindfold, he was in the middle of a thick woods, and he was terrified. Every twig that snapped, he would visualize a wild animal ready to pounce. After what seemed like an eternity, dawn broke, and the first rays of sunlight entered the interior of the forest. Looking around, the boy saw flowers, trees, and the outline of the path. And then, to his utter astonishment, he beheld the figure of a man standing just a few feet away, armed with a bow and an arrow. Who do you think it was? His father. It was his father. And he had been there all night long. I believe for David, this occasion of how God was with him as his time in the Philistine territory came to a close was God's final way of assuring David that God was with him and that he was going to watch over him and protect him. And he promises to do that for us as well as we continue to trust him and go through some of those dark nights in our soul, those dark nights in our spirit, and maybe even in our body, where we're just not sure what the next day might bring. God was with David in a powerful and in a mighty way. Now, 1 Samuel chapter 31, we're going to conclude this morning by just reading the first 6 verses. And it tells us here that now the Philistines fought against Israel. Remember, they're up there. The Philistines are at Shunem. The Israelites are at Gilboa. The Philistines fought fought against Israel, and the Israelites fled before them, and many fell slain on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines pressed hard after Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The fighting grew fierce around Saul, and when the archers overtook him, they wounded him critically. Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me." But his armor-bearer was terrified and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul and his 3 sons and his armor-bearer and all his men died together that same day. So they fought against Israel. The Philistines pressed hard after Saul. That was common practice in a battle. If they knew the king was there, if they knew the leader was nearby, go after him. And you get the leader, and you know you've killed the ace. You've killed the kingpin. And so that was kind of a normal thing. And so they pressed hard, it says, after Saul and after his sons. And they killed all of Saul's sons. And then somehow they trapped Saul. Saul was wounded. And Saul realized that either the Philistines were going to get to him or he could take his own life. And that's how Saul's life came to an end. He fell on his sword and he died on Mount Gilboa. A man who was really broken. And as Samuel had said in the vision that he was brought up in the night, from the dead, he said, "Tomorrow you will be with me. You will join me in the realm of the dead." And it's really just a tragic story of the first king of Israel. God's people wanted a king. And they got a king that was tall and handsome and just stood out above the rest. And yet he proved to be someone who really lived very much by the strength of his own flesh and made decisions in his flesh. And he really didn't rely on God and trust in God. He didn't seek the wisdom of God. And when God did give him wisdom and God did give him direction, he wasn't obedient to it. Pat read for us out of Proverbs chapter 1 there. And I just want to turn to that proverb once again here in closing and remind us of what the writer of Proverbs tells us. And he is saying this in light of the value and the benefit of learning wisdom and gaining wisdom and trusting God. But he says in verse 23, "If you had responded to my rebuke, I would have poured out my heart to you and made my thoughts known to you." I think if Saul would have responded to God's rebuke at different times in a different way, things could have been different in Saul's life. But this proverb says, "But since you rejected me when I called, and no one gave heed when I stretched out my hand, and since you ignored all my advice and would not accept my rebuke, in turn I will laugh at your disaster. I will mock when calamity overtakes you. When calamity overtakes you like a storm, when disaster sweeps you like a whirlwind, then you will call to me, but I will not answer. You will look for me, but will not find me." I don't know really how it was with Samuel as he was brought up from the dead there in chapter 29 or chapter 28. And how much Samuel could, if Samuel had emotions and all. But I think that must have been difficult for Samuel to be realizing that here Saul was calling him up out of the dead, and he was not able to give him any good news, but a message of rejection, a message of judgment. and finality and death. I think that must have been difficult. And the writer of Proverbs here tells us that, and we don't read that God laughed at Saul here at his calamity, but that's what it says here, that I will laugh at your disaster. I will mock when calamity overtakes you. I don't think we like to think of God so much in that way and like that. And I don't think literally God laughs at when people suffer from disobedience. But when we reject God and when we don't accept his guidance and his direction and his advice, it's just a sad time in our lives and in the lives of those around us. And it's important, it's necessary. As the story of Saul and 1 Samuel come to a close, it is truly a tragic way to end this portion. And we're not going to be moving into 2 Samuel, at least not at this point. But there we see how now God then allows David to reign and to be installed as king and reign. And of course, David then reigns for a long time as the king of Israel. But it's just a tragic story here as we come to the end of 1 Samuel of what happens in Saul's life as he ultimately finds himself at the short end of the stick in regards to his relationship with God and his authority and his kingship. I'm going to share this illustration in closing, and then we're going to have a closing prayer and dismiss. Not sure where this illustration comes from, but it says time-lapse photography. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, but time-lapse photography compresses a series of events into one picture. Such a photo appeared in an issue of National Geographic. It was taken from a Rocky Mountain peak during a heavy thunderstorm, and the picture captured the brilliant lightning display that had taken place throughout the storm's duration. The time-lapse technique created a fascinating spaghetti-like web out of the individual bolts of lightning. And it says this, that in such a way our sin presents itself before the eyes of God. Where we see only isolated or individual acts, God sees the overall web of our sinning. What may seem insignificant, even sporadic to us, and passes with hardly a notice, creates a much more dramatic display from God's panoramic viewpoint. The psalmist was right when he wrote, "Who can discern his errors? Acquit me of hidden faults. Keep back your servant from presumptuous sins." As we conclude this story and this chapter, or this book of 1 Samuel, and see the end of Saul's life, and think about, as it describes here in this illustration, this time-lapse photography, and maybe just think about ourselves. We often, we don't think about our shortcomings and failures in light of all of our life. We kind of think of them sometimes as isolated events, but you see, God sees the whole picture. And God sees what he has done and what he is doing and what we have done. And he calls us to respond to him in a positive and in a right way. In an attitude of faith, in an attitude of humility, in an attitude of trust. And that's really, I think, the testimony of Saul's life. We see up to the end here, and right at the end, Saul goes ahead and he does something that he has declared is wrong, is sinful, is to consult the occult and witchcraft. And God's judgment of Saul is very sad and yet very final. God calls us to continue to seek him in a way that is calling us to a deeper faith and a deeper commitment to him in walking with him and being what he wants us to be. We're going to stand together now and just close this morning with a closing prayer and a benediction. And we'll not sing a song in closing this morning, but let's stand together for our closing now. Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the truth of your word. And we just ask, Lord, that as this book of 1 Samuel ends on this very sober note, Father, that we might take all that we have heard to heart, and that we might just continue to seek you in our own lives, and to allow you to work in our hearts and work in our lives, reveal to us the areas of our life that are displeasing to you, and help us, Lord, to confess those and to turn away from those things, and to allow you to just become more of the person that you want us to be, in faith, in trust, in confidence, and in obedience to what you want us to do and how you want us to live our lives. And we pray, Lord, that you would just enable us to experience your blessing and to be a blessing to those around us. And so now we dismiss this congregation in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. And you are dismissed. Thank you, and may God bless you.